Welcome back to the Making It podcast. Today's probably one of the most special ones for me because this is Judy Kingston, and we are sat in her garden right now. And Judy is the most committed listener we have. And now Judy is on the podcast on Making It Moments, and we are going to discover what making it means to Judy, and we're going to discover a lot about Judy. So first of all, Judy, how are you today? And would you like to explain how we met?
I'm good today because I'm sitting in the garden in the sunshine talking to Dan, who's become very special to me. So I'm good.
So how did we meet, Judy?
Well, we met because I've always loved gardening, and but I'm getting old, and looking at the garden is not vast, but things like lifting and that sort of thing I can't do. And I'd actually stood in the garden and cried. And then the next day, there was a knock at the door, and there was Dan and Leo saying, "Had I got any odd jobs?" They wanted to earn some money over the summer. So, unfortunately for them, they got stuck in the garden and did lots and lots of jobs for me. And over the summer and over the summers since, they've always come back and we did jobs. But we also had lots of incredibly interesting conversations. And from my point of view, I've always called them my miracle gardeners because they sort of turned up in response to a prayer that I didn't actually say. So that's how we met.
Now, what inspired your love of gardening? Because the gardening is the thing that built our relationship to what it is now. Now you say we have these live conversations, but what built your love for gardening?
Well, Dan and Jamie have been very brave talking about some of the difficult moments in their life and then reflecting on those experiences later. And for me, that is a part of my gardening journey. So when I was 4, very sadly, my dad had a brain tumor and died, leaving my mum with 4 of us, but luckily also leaving us with a house with a garden. And so because we were poor, we grew vegetables, we grew raspberries, we grew blackberries, we grew fruit trees, and I was heavily involved in that, and I just absolutely loved it. So that, I think, is what that very sad event actually started me off on the gardening journey. And also because in those days, remember, we're talking 75 years ago when I was doing this, the entertainment wasn't there. So we used to go for walks, we used to potter about in the countryside. Um, and so also I learned to love nature at that point too. So yeah, that's how I learned about gardening and nature and loved it.
What is making it to you, Judy? What does making it mean to Judy?
Well, I first came across the idea with your podcast, and at the time I actually looked it up. What is making it? And it was all about success. Have you got a successful career? Have you got a successful relationship? Have you got successful relationships? So it was all about success. And then, of course, I realised what was success for me might not be success for other people. So I might successfully take a little cutting in the garden, whereas that might not be a success for you, Dan. Um, for me, it means, um, yes, making it to become the person I'd really like to be. Obviously, that has different aspects, but yeah, that's what making it about for me.
What really matters to you, Judy?
Well, that's been interesting with the Making It podcast, really, because listening to you two talking, I was thinking the things that matter to me are not necessarily the same as what matters to other people. Um, and years ago, somebody actually asked me that question, what matters to you? And at the time, thinking about it, I said, God, family, friends. When I thought about it lately, I've also added the garden and nature and community. Um, and also, as Dan and I have talked about, the word God is difficult for lots of people, including me, in that it has all sorts of horrible images attached to it. So I've changed that word to how it feels to me, which is there's something more going on. So, and that does matter to me. It's an important part of my life. And so,
Just to clarify, what would you mean by horrible images? As in, like the typical stereotype of like a man in the sky sort of thing?
well, exactly, that's
Yeah,
exactly
yeah,
what you said when I
yeah.
said, when we talked about God. And then for me as a child, I suppose, having lost my dad so early, and also my mum was ill for a year and I lived away for a year. And and then in the years I went to church, there was this, I had this image of this was a sort of man with a stick, and if I was naughty, I'd be punished. Um, so that was unhelpful images for me. And as I say, over the years, I don't think that anymore. And also, I'm more, as I say, experiencing rather than having a belief about God. It's more about experiencing something more going on in my life.
And how important is that? That's something more. If you didn't have that something more, would your days be a lot different?
Incredibly different. Um, yes, very different. That's an interesting question because it's as though this something more is here and there and there, and all the time, what that something more and here is saying, I'm noticing, I'm thinking about, and what does that mean for me? So that would be a huge difference for me.
Can you think of a specific time? And instantly my mind thinks of how we met, to be honest, where you feel like that something more made a big impact on your life.
Well, certainly at the time, it just seemed what people would call a coincidence that I'd been howling in the garden about the garden, and then up comes Jamie and Leo offering to do things. And so for me, that is a something more moment, something more going on here, thank goodness. And yeah, that was a very powerful something more moment for me.
So we've spoken about a lots of things, me and you, Judy, and I know the podcasts have inspired you to think about your life and the things that have been really mattered to you in your life. And I know one of the things that you mentioned was how surrounding yourself with like-minded people is so important. Now, why would you say it's so important?
Um, because it perhaps I'm cowardly, but if you have a lot of people around you or you come across people who really don't share your values and things that matter to you, it's hard to have a conversation. It's hard to relate to them. I have to say, rather shamefully, it's hard to like them often. And the people, it's interesting about the people or whatever I surround myself by, they are so supportive to me. They are very supportive to me too, and I can bounce my ideas off them, and that's immensely helpful. But when we talk about surrounding yourself with people that matter to me, it's hilarious, really, because I realize that some of those people are not the worldly wise, as it were. I mean, Five Little Fred, who lives across the road, is a very dear friend, and we do share a love of creativity and we share a love of the garden. But I'm quite sure that if I beat him at pick a sticks, he would unfriend me. So that's one little friend I have. And people from the past. I mean, I've often said to you, Dad, oh, I read this today, something from the Celtic writers or something from a mystic who lived hundreds of years ago. They are, to me, quite real people in my life that help me to define what matters, help me to define what really means something to me. And actually, I mean, even Annie the cat, um, she loves the garden, she loves to eat, she loves to sleep, so I can certainly identify with her with that. But I wouldn't want to catch and demolish dragonflies, which she would. Um, so yes, and the garden itself, of course. The garden itself, it is like a friend. Um, so I'm not going to grow plants I don't like. I might dig them out if they don't perform. But I walk out the back door in the morning and I see these lovely yellow daisies, and they speak to me. They say, "Oh, for goodness sake, brighten up," because I tend to be a bit serious. So all these friends are not necessarily people I have around me now.
When you say the garden is almost like your friend, how much would you say the garden reflects your life?
Well, it does, in that communication is very important to me. So it does reflect. Um, when I see, as I say, the sunflowers speak, or the tomatoes say to me, "You chucked a mouldy tomato away in the bin, and now the compost has sprouted tomatoes." So it says to me things like, don't abandon things too soon. After a while, they may be quite useful. Um, so yes, and it also reflects it reflects the things I love. It reflects nature. It reflects my biology students used to say that plants were boring, but they're not. I just love them to bits. So that reflects my love of plants. It reflects my desire to nurture, because obviously with a garden you have to nurture the plants, make sure they grow. And as again Jamie's mentioned, and you, Dan, you talk about watering them. And certainly this year it's been very hot, and kindly Dan watered my orchid patch in the summer. And you have to choose, as they've said, who do you water in your life? That has been a very important reflection for me this year. Who is it? I hate to say worth watering, but are there some people at this particular moment that are quite unhelpful? And maybe for the time being, at least, I won't nurture those relationships. So it does reflect what's going on in my life a lot.
When we talk about other people and like-minded people and the things and the people you've mentioned, how important is it and does it matter what other people think of us?
Well, I'd like to say no, because it sounds very much more sort of self-contained and got it all together. And I thought about it since we've had this again. You've had the conversation on the podcast, and Jamie in Australia, in a totally different environment, has obviously found that quite difficult and bravely shared it. And I've thought about it, and I think, on the whole, it doesn't matter to me if I have different views from other people. So if you ask me, well, not podcast, Brexit was the big issue. A lot of my friends didn't think like I did, and that didn't bother me. That's just their opinion. But if somebody says to me something about who I am and who I want to be, particularly again, people that I care about, that does matter. I find it really hard if people say things that suggest I don't care, or yes, that I'm being very difficult to them and that sort of
Do you
thing.
feel like you should? Do you feel like in that position where maybe someone's made it personal about you, or they've almost, I don't want to say the word attacked, because maybe it's not quite to that level, but maybe attacked who you feel like you are? Do we as people need to learn and grow how to block that out? Or shall we just accept that it does make us feel a certain way and then it makes us feel a certain way about that person?
Blocking that person out. Obviously, on social media, that's become something that people do. They unfriend people. But you have to remember, when I grew up, there weren't such things as social media. We didn't have a phone, a television, a car, a computer, a camera, or anything. So, on the whole, it was quite easy in those days if someone had been horrid, just to avoid them fairly easily. I think nowadays, with all that goes on social media, um, my experience of which is fairly limited, but um, it's more difficult, really. Sorry, I've got quietly strayed from what you asked me. Ask me exactly what you asked me.
Should we try and find ways to block out what people say, or should we just embrace what they say, and then it makes us learn about that person?
Well, we obviously need to listen and decide if it's some sort of fairly personal criticism, is that actually true? If it is, do I need to change? If it isn't, so what, really? Um, but it's very, when I was young, I was sent to church. I read the Bible. I came across these wonderful stories about people that dealt with all sorts of situations. And some of them were suggesting, particularly the New Testament stories, were talking about how you deal with things like that. Unfortunately, in things like the there's a parable of the lost sheep where somebody loses one sheep out of 100 and goes to find it. So you think maybe these people are lost sheep that I need to be looking for. Um, so it is difficult to know to what extent certainly if people are definitely harming you, I think it's necessary at that point to say no, don't want this person in my life. What one writer I knew called poisonous friends. Um, so at that point, no. Especially if you're feeling very vulnerable. At that point, you don't want poisonous friends.
And it all links to what we were talking about with like-minded people and how the people who are like-minded affect us in a positive way. They make us more ourselves. But those as you class as poisonous do the opposite of that. So it's about limiting our time with those people, just like you say. Now, something which I know we speak about on a daily basis is reflection and gratitude. Those two words, what do they mean to you?
It is interesting when I was thinking about talking today and thinking about all the podcasts I've listened to, certain of the topics, all those topics have been incredibly interesting and helpful. But as you say, some of them seem to keep coming up as incredibly important. Um, and those two, I think, are two of the very important ones. You already mentioned the surrounding yourself with friends, like minded people, but reflection. That's, it's a very busy world. Um, Particularly you younger people have very busy lives. Luckily, my life to a certain extent is as busy as I choose. Though some days it doesn't seem like that. It seems the day chooses to be busy without me trying. But it is important reflection. And I mean, just thinking about what I might say today and looking back on what the podcast said and looking back on my past experiences, incredibly helpful in working out what is important, what do I really care about, and what is really important to me in life. And certainly when I was at a very low point and actually signed off from work, I actually used to, somebody, it was a very good suggestion, said, when you go to bed at night, write down 3 positives from the day. And even on a day that had been awful in other ways, I could always do it. And it's so helpful because it does make you grateful, as you were saying, but it makes you less judgmental. You know, if you're trying to look at what was good about that conversation and you're reflecting on it, if you reflect on it in a positive light and think about it at the end of the day positively, then you're less judgmental. And being judgmental is not good. It's not good for you. It's obviously, even if you don't tell the person, it changes your attitude. So for me, those writing down 3 positives as a form of reflection is very, very helpful.
So, what three positives would you say you've learnt from today? And I know it's only probably about 10:30 right now or 11:15, but could you name three positives from your day already today?
Dan, you're diverting from the script. um, Look at the day. Just for me, that's wonderful. So that's one positive, beautiful day. Um, I had a lovely couple of communications from the family, a couple with photos. So positive to see them enjoying holidays and thinking. Um, what's another positive today? Oh, Annie the cat came and woke me up. She's a very shy cat. And suddenly I felt this sort of snuffling. And there was this face looking at me and sort of snuffling at me, which was the cat. So that was a very good moment because she's quite shy and not usually get so close. So there's three good moments from today.
Thank you. What life experiences? I know we've touched on some already, but what life experiences do you feel like have really helped you in your life?
Um, well, isn't that interesting? Because obviously losing my dad was awful, but it has helped me because it gave me various skills I wouldn't have otherwise had. And it also, when I think about it, it's molded a lot of who I am. Not all good, obviously, but it has made me care about people, especially little ones and their experiences. Um, so that reflection was helping. I thought about when I was working and in terms of career success, I taught biology to sixth formers, I taught psychology to sixth formers. I in worldly sense. At one point, I ran biology. At one point, I was head of psychology. At one point, I did both when everybody had sort of left. But that wasn't what mattered. So that experience really showed me that in terms of my career, what mattered was the students. Um, how can I help them to achieve their goals, which was at that point to pass their A levels? How can I nurture that? And what's helpful for that? And not only for biology, but how can I help them to love the world that I love? And how can, with psychology, how can I share my experiences of ways that are helpful to live? Um, so, yes, those are two things that I have reflected upon. And with conversations with Dan, we've talked about various issues that we've then reflected upon, which have been very helpful. It helped me clarify what I really think. And I have to say, what I really think at this moment, what one thinks does change over time. I have to say a lot.
So when obviously these experiences which you've had, and quite literally right now you are sharing these experiences for others to listen to. How important do you feel it is to share our experiences and our learnings with other people from our own journey?
The trouble with that question is, when we were worrying about, well, I was worrying about what, or we were thinking about, does it matter what people think? Um, when Dan was talking about the podcast, I was thinking, I hope he's not going to set me up as a source of great wisdom. um, um, the other thought was, I hope he's not going to set me up as a silly old fool, which were equally terrifying. But I've lived a long time. I've had a lot of experience. I'm amazed and impressed how Dan and Jamie can do a podcast and discuss all sorts of useful experiences that has taken me a lifetime to learn. And certainly watching their podcast has reminded me of some of these things. But also, it's also reminded me myself. And if he thought some of these experiences were worth sharing, that's good. And I know when I talk to people, I often think, oh, I remember when I did this, and I hope it is worth doing. I hope it does help people in certain situations in life that I might have been through or similarly been through.
So, outside of advice to other people and telling other people about your experiences and then they can learn from that, if you could speak to your younger self right now, if little Judy came walking along here and you could just give her a piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be?
For goodness sake, comb your hair. No, we've talked about this podcast and sort of setting goals and working towards our goals so we make it. But a lot of life isn't like that. A lot of life just sort of happens. And for that little girl who at that time experienced a lot of very horrible things and obviously had a whole life ahead of her, to a certain extent, I would say just go with the flow. You know, look at what's going on, look at opportunities, what really matters. Just push doors and see what happens. And that whole idea of being open to life and what happens, open to getting ideas, open to learning, open to this is a very difficult moment for me, Dan, because I'm saying open to what God might be saying, which this is not a religious broadcast, but I think for that 5-year-old, I'd love her to experience some sense of there's something more going on here, and is it worth getting to know more about this something more, and including that in your life. And I have to say, um, this wasn't scripted, Dan. That I would say yes, that's worth exploring.
After everything we've spoken about and after all the topics we explore ourselves on a daily basis and you reflect on in your own life on a personal level, and we talk about it a lot, whether as people we ever actually make it. Do you feel like you have made it? And if so, what does that mean to you?
Well, you see, again, if you look, do a search, what is making it? The word success, as I've said, comes up ever such a lot. And as I've already said, what does success mean? And in worldly terms, it often does mean having an incredibly successful career, earning lots of money. But also, I think there are ideas about being happy with where you are, being happy with your values, being happy with what matters to you. And from that point of view, yes, I am. I'm always alert, prepared to learn and grow. But from the points of view of career and pretty much a lot of the time, not really worrying about what's going on and what people are saying. I've got better at trusting my own decisions, trusting my own values, trusting the people I've chosen to include in my life. I have, to a certain extent, made it. But if you say, am I still trying to make it? I would say yes.
Judy, coming towards the end of this podcast, which I just have to say has been a very peaceful moment for me. And for the listeners, I don't know if you've been able to pick up any of it, but there's building work going on around Judy's neighbours, and it's quite interesting because amongst the chaos, you can still have peace. Is there anything you would like to say before we conclude the podcast?
Well, Dan asked me if I'd made it, and I was thinking, I'm 81. Am I still trying to make it? And I am. You know, I can always improve the garden. Well, provided Dan and Leo come, I can improve the garden and I can make it more suitable for wildlife, and I can continue to interact with my community, and hopefully, I mean, they're amazing for me, but hopefully I can support them. I can continue to interact with the people that matters to me. Thank goodness, as I say, for WhatsApp. And so I am still trying to improve all those areas of my life. And yeah, I am still trying to do that. And also touching again on the making it, I'm trying to be more observant. When things happen, as with the incidents of where we met, but lots of others, I'm trying to think, yeah, what's that telling me? What's that telling me? That whole area. And I will say, finally, I've also enjoyed as friends, although they often lived hundreds of years ago, lots of people from the past who were much more high-mindedly focused than I am. But people like Francis of Assisi, who loved nature. And he said things like, make me a channel of your peace. I mean, goodness, how about that for a way of making it? And somebody else called Teresa Ravilla said, nothing is wasted, which Jamie and Dan explored. Does life have meaning? So, yeah, those sort of things I want to continue to enjoy and continue to have as part of my life.
Well, Judy, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. And before we end it, I would just like to say how much of an impact you've had on my life and how much of an impact you still have on my life. And as much as obviously in this garden is where it started, and we knocked on, me and Leo, and we did some garden work, I appreciate you very much, and you've become a friend of mine. And very much appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your life experiences with others. And I just wanted to say how much of a lovely lady you are and a lovely soul. So thank you very much, Judy.
I am allowed to unfriend you, aren't I? No, thank you, Dan. Well, it's mutual. I never expected to have a young, wise, creative friend in my life at this stage, and it's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. That's been Judy Kingston, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Feel so fine.